Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the intro, and more than anything else, thanks to Accel for putting together this event. I already had a chance to meet several folks who are founders here in India. I didn't realize the ecosystem was growing that fast. It's a really great initiative, and hoping to meet more folks over the course of the day. I'm going to take a little bit of time just to talk about exposure management. To be clear, I do work for a company that focuses on this, but that's not the reason I'm talking about this. I actually do think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in the exposure management space, broadly speaking, and a lot of that could come out of here. And I thought it might be good to talk a little bit about what those opportunities are and what the dynamics are around them. So we'll talk about the emergence and growth of exposure management, some of the pain points, the impact that the SOC feels as a result of not being able to address the underlying challenges, the metrics that are typically used to think about exposure management, and then we'll talk about the operational life cycle, which is where I think there's a lot of innovation opportunity. So I want to start by just highlighting that a few years ago when I started in the overall space, it was something that we had to educate customers a lot about. And today, things have changed. Most of what we deal with are RFIs that are clearly targeted at exposure management, and specifically in our case, at external exposure management, which is great. This year, Gartner's semi-annual survey or annual survey around trends calls out exposure management as the single fastest growing trend in the SOC. And it's got a second section, and that's why if you're wondering where's all the AI stuff, it's on the other side. But CTEM, exposure management, and the framework that Gartner recommends to implement it, which is called continuous threat exposure management, have sort of emerged as a dominant trend. The reason is below. It's because Gartner believes that the impact in terms of breach reduction for organizations who can effectively deliver and maintain a program around exposure management is significant, at the order of 2/3 reduction of breaches. I don't know what that data is based on, but that's driving, I think, a lot of interest and awareness in the space. As I said, we're seeing the results of that in real projects. So if you're on the founding side here, you're sort of thinking about attaching to projects that are proximate and that have a high level of active interest, then there's no doubt that exposure management does carry a lot of that. Currently, roughly about half of customers polled by Gartner have active projects in this area. And also, it's not just in the large enterprise market. I know in some of the past discussions we were talking about things like there has to be a focus, and maybe it's large enterprise, maybe it's a certain theater or geography. That's all true, but I'll just highlight that the demand here for exposure management does go upstream and downstream. What does that mean for founders? In part, that you may have an indirect channel that can help you early on already, which is not typically the case in other spaces that have been in early. You usually start high end, and the managed services interest doesn't show up till later. So what are the fundamental challenges that we're thinking about when we talk about exposure management? It tends to come down to the three shown here. I mean, we're talking to CISOs all the time who say that breaches, small and large, are often tied back to assets that were exposed, but they didn't realize that those assets were exposed out to the internet. And so, as you can imagine, assets that you're not aware of being exposed are typically going to be the ones that are undermanaged, unmanaged, vulnerable, and as a result, they become attractive targets to the adversary. So visibility is a huge challenge, just the amount of exposure. And the next part is moving from that exposure to real risk, which is being able to test all of that. If you do invest in the visibility piece, which is where this whole exposure management market was a few years ago, then the next challenge became moving from awareness of exposure to real risk. And that required really scaling out all kinds of testing, because you're talking about at least large organizations having hundreds of thousands of exposed assets that they didn't realize were exposed. And now you're having to test all of them with tens of thousands of potential security tests of various kinds. So there's a cost, a cadence element that complicates that. And so security testing is the second challenge. And then prioritizing the findings is the third big one. I'm sure any of you who've been on the operating side have heard that your VM programs output thousands of issues. The capacity of most organizations is far less than that, let's say, on a monthly basis, perhaps a few hundred, even for large organizations. So this three-part challenge is really what defines the core issues around exposure management. Although I focus a little bit more on external exposure management, there's a lot of opportunity, I would say, in internal exposure management as well. I think the key questions to ask organizations if you want to engage in this topic is what we generally will ask, what percent of assets do you think you're aware of that are exposed out there? And I'll tell you that the answer we typically get is 50, 70, 80, 90%. And it's not that organizations and CISOs aren't aware that the missing 5, 10, 20% is significant. What's noteworthy is that they don't realize that they're actually unaware of a majority of what's exposed. That is the challenge. And when they realize that, then they realize that the problem is even bigger than they originally thought. So that's the first thing you have to uncover is how deep is the issue for an organization. And then secondly, how much of it are they able to test, at least for what they know. So maybe they tell you that they're aware of 10,000 exposed assets, some mix of domains, web apps, IP addresses, certificates, whatnot. And they're testing it at some cadence. How much are they testing? What percent are they testing? At what cadence are they testing it? Because as you probably know, another major challenge in the area of security today is simply around the cost, cadence, complexity, and coverage of security testing. And we have still so much inefficiency in even pen testing budgets where we're doing the exercise so infrequently against such a narrow set of applications, let's say, often that aren't even the ones that attackers will target. Much of that can be changed by approaching the problem differently. And it has to end with prioritization, because if you ask organizations what's the gap between what they uncover today, not even with an investment in this area, and what they have the bandwidth to act on, there's going to be a huge delta. And that's what we're talking about being able to change. So the level of the problems, to go one level deeper, in visibility, starts with mapping. Being able to understand what an organization's overall structure is. That means their business units, their departments, their subsidiaries, their affiliates, and how they map to each other in terms of ownership. And once that business structure is built, to be able to attach the asset or the infrastructure layer to that business structure. Typically, this is very low. It's sub 50% in terms of mapping. And if you don't know what assets belong to what subsidiary, and if you don't have context around what assets are more attractive from an external exposure standpoint, for example, what web apps capture PII, which ones are transactional, which ones may not be protected by a WAF, and so on, then you lack the business context to make real-time decisions on which ones to really go after. When it comes to risk assessment, the big problem certainly is coverage. I think I've met a few founders here who are tackling the problems around, some problems around AppSec between yesterday and today. I hope that part of the problems that you're hoping to address might be around coverage. When we ask what's their coverage with DAST, it is in single digits most often. Now, part of that has to do with architecture and cost and other factors like that. But the bottom line is that organizations are doing more and more app development. They have more and more exposed web apps, and a growing portion of that real estate is not being tested, and there's a lot of missing context. So the second piece is really being able to uncover the context around these exposed assets. A related problem with testing, of course, tends to be the false positive challenge, and it's particularly problematic to get. That part is very challenging to get exposure management operationalized, because at the end of the day, the security teams are not the ones that are going to remediate the stuff. They're going to have to communicate with some subsidiary, maybe in a different country, that they don't regularly work with, and ask them to solve a problem, to go patch something. And when they find out, when the request is made and they find out it's a false positive, the target asset really doesn't have the problem, it just erodes trust between SecOps and IT ops. So That's a real challenge that has to be addressed, and the only way to do it is by improving the efficacy of the testing solutions, much higher confidence testing. Today, we still see a lot of testing relying on passive techniques that have very high false positive rates. And then the last one is, of course, prioritization, which really requires a lot of context leverage. And ideally, with something like this, the context should be extrapolated about the assets, and it should also, in part, be about the attacker. So how attractive might the exposure that was discovered be to the attacker? How easily discoverable might it be from the attacker's perspective? And how vulnerable, of course, because those factors are what an attacker is likely to use to figure out what's a path of low or very low or least resistance into an organization, rather than build some complex, advanced persistent threat to get in somewhere when there's a gaping hole. So this is the current state of external exposure management today, and as you can probably extrapolate from this, it creates an unfair advantage for the adversaries. And so it's a problem worth solving, and perhaps that's why it's a problem that's risen to the top of the priority list more recently over the last year. So the metrics that we see organizations wanting to address are the ones on the left here, org and asset visibility, and both matter. If you don't uncover the org structure, and we'll talk about how you do that automatically, but it's really important to be able to uncover the entire business layer and then the infrastructure layer and map those two as definitively as possible so that ownership can be ascertained. And then, of course, coverage in testing, prioritization. In the end, a lot of CISOs tell us that the end metric they really care about is mean time to remediation. It's not the only one, but it is a significant one. This is where organizations are when they're doing it manually. Maybe half at best in terms of visibility, maybe half of that, a third of that being actually tested. So you multiply that out, you're talking about 10% maybe being tested, and low on cadence as well. So there's a big gaping hole from the attacker's perspective that they can exploit, and yet so much of our investment from SOC budgets does go into the defensive arena. So there's an opportunity to fix it. Attack surface management solutions emerged about 3-4 years ago and started fixing the problem, but there were a lot of drawbacks in the first generation technology that didn't help improve the outcomes in terms of visibility, coverage, cadence, mean time to remediation. You can see that where we see customers sometimes now getting to with a solution and still looking for a replacement because they realize that the gap is still too big. So they're improving discovery, but they still know that there's a lot of assets missing. Often it's because the vendors they're working with are doing things behind the scenes manually with analysts. And that approach always breaks over time because it's a costly effort for the vendors. And so as they start cutting corners over time, it's the customer that ends up with diminished visibility, reduced testing, and so on. We do see some large organizations over the last few years having successfully gotten things better by making a heavy investment in people and process, which I'll talk about in a second. And they've gotten to that 80-90% level of visibility, 80-90% of testing and coverage. Maybe they're at a biweekly cadence on average across their exposed assets. Maybe they're at days in MTTR. But is that adequate to protect against the adversary that's just looking for that one path of low resistance, that one web app that you didn't know wasn't unmanaged, that does capture PII, that is a login page, there's a transactional page, perhaps. That tends to be the challenge. And really, we have to somehow shift to the right, as close to the right as possible. That can only be done by more innovation in this space. Obviously, I'll say that we do some of it, but I also think there's a lot of, as we talk through the life cycle, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more in many areas of the life cycle that I'll touch on. So this is the bottom line of what we're trying to get to. How does some of this happen behind the scenes? That first step of mapping organizations and discovering assets, unfortunately, by the first generation of technologies, too much of it was focused on a manual effort. So sifting through financial reports, paying for an S&P subscription, looking at doing Google crawling, Crunchbase, those kinds of data sources. But this area is very conducive to natural language processing and AI. Discovery as an area. We started with natural language processing, and we see a lot of application in discovery for AI. It's very good at taking public domain sources and establishing high confidence relationships between all the substructures of an organization, discovering them and mapping them out. And then doing the same thing at the asset discovery. A lot of that can also be mapped using just open source tools. But the automation hasn't been adequate. And when the automation is inadequate, or when there are false positives and false negatives, that's where things break down in the space, because it's very hard to go to other teams and get them to buy into a recurring process when there's a lot of noise built into it. It's not uncommon for us to go to a large organization that says Fortune 500, but even for a global organization, a Global 2000 company, for there to be hundreds of orgs and millions of assets that they didn't know about that are exposed. Those then have to be attributed and classified, because that classification is what you need to leverage in order to tackle the problems of prioritizing the outcomes. So who owns these assets? So you can do certain easy things like say, here are certain types of applications, whether they're SaaS or internally deployed apps that are clearly going to be used by marketing and so on. You can also pull from places like CMDB, but those integrations have been lacking in the past. So improving these integrations and making them bona fide integrations with other sources of data is something that's happening more. And there's a lot of room for automated orchestration in this area that I think is an emerging area that would be very valuable. But not uncommon with this phase to then say, okay, I saw hundreds of orgs, millions of assets, and I found that across these apps there are hundreds of APIs that are endpoints that are exposed, and hundreds of apps, web apps that capture PII and therefore have sensitive data that I should protect. And then, of course, all of this has to be tested at scale. As I said, a lot of testing today for these web apps is in the single-digit numbers. So being able to scale that out is more of an infrastructure exercise, because you have to have ideally a distributed network that does this in a low and slow manner and doesn't trip alerts, because you're trying to mimic the attacker's approach. But if you do that, you will end up with hundreds of thousands of findings. And that leads to the bigger problem, which is, how do I bring that down to just the subset of gaps that matter? How do I take those 100,000 and use a combination of what's going to be most easily discoverable by the attacker, and how many hops do they have to make, for example, to get to an asset? How attractive is it to them? An exposed database, Oracle database with or without sensitive data, but exposed Oracle database is probably going to be more interesting than, let's say, a headless IoT device. So using attractiveness, discoverability, exploit intelligence, and merging all of that with criticality to say, well, you have hundreds of thousands, but when you really factor all of that business context and asset context and currency in exploit intelligence, then you come down to just a subset that is manageable for your security team. And in the end, there has to be a lot of orchestration in here. This is another problem where I think in the first couple of years, vendors didn't focus adequately on, and so a lot of organizations were happy first round just to say, okay, at least I know what I didn't know. Better to at least know about my exposure than to not know about it. And then as they sat on that data, it became clear, like, hey, there's a lot of it. I want to know where the risk is. And then the next step, of course, then becomes I want to be able to triage the risk that really matters. And then there's the part that requires remediating all of that. There are a few areas here that can really benefit from AI, especially on the discovery side, but also on the remediation front. And then it's probably going to take a little bit longer from what we can see, but security testing, generating the tests. Today, we find that there's a higher fidelity in the work we've put in to build some of those tests, but it will get there. It's a matter of time. And so this whole life cycle can really get a lot better, which I think will also drive its adoption dramatically. It can't, by the way, all of this, Gartner will tell you that, CISOs know it, All of this across external and internal exposure management can't be done, and I don't think anyone's going to claim that they do all of it. We focus on the external part of it, but there's a lot of opportunity to tackle as an ecosystem. If there's more innovation here that's accelerated for organizations to partner together to tackle the problem in a more complete way. And if that's done right, then you hopefully tackle a few different use cases. And I think different vendors have an opportunity to optimize for different things, depending on the architectures they choose. So the obvious ones are just understanding the exposure and risk. And the next one tends to be remediating the critical issues. Not everyone goes all the way, by the way. It just depends where organizations are in the maturity curve of exposure management. They will eventually get there, but it might take a couple of years. Improving testing coverage and cadence seems to be emerging as a fairly big area over the last year or two. There's a lot of admission around the inefficiency in web app testing and pen testing budgets. And M&A tends to be a big urgency driver in investments in this area. So an organization that's invested in a capability here that understands and quantifies its risk, let's just for simplicity use an A through F scale and say that as a large bank I am at A minus, and I'm planning to acquire a smaller community bank that doesn't have the same budget or processes or technologies, and they're at a D when I apply the same exposure management technology, that then becomes the path of least resistance. It doesn't matter that I'm at an A minus. So this has become a big area, not just once intent to acquire has been established, but even before that. They want to talk to exposure management companies that can say, I will be talking to 100 companies this year. I will shortlist 10 of them and I will acquire 2 of them. I want to have this kind of information from the outset with all 100. Maybe not at the same level of depth, but almost thinking of it as a funnel with the risk awareness at every stage as they proceed down and evaluate them from a business standpoint for acquisition. And then subsidiary risk is another big one. Where is my risk? Is it in a specific country within a certain subsidiary that we acquired last year, wherever that may be? Where do I place my bets to bring the overall risk up and to take out specifically paths of low or very low resistance that the attacker is most likely to go after? Everything I've talked about, there are lots of tools that can be used for this stuff, and many of you are probably familiar with a lot of them. You can do discovery with all kinds of tools that are out there. I list some of them here. And then there's manual work to stitch this stuff together. There's a lot you can do with attribution and classification as well, using tools that are out there, open source tools, OSINT capabilities. You can pull from other sources whenever available. It's not always available. But each of these problems expands out into various tools that organizations have or can invest in. The challenge is that, as is, when you build this out across all of this, one, there's a lot of human middleware in all of this. Eventually it breaks. And it goes back to that problem I was describing earlier where if there's a lot of noise here, especially false positives, then the process breaks down. And next time you send that request to a subsidiary somewhere else, they're unlikely to sort of collaborate in that process. So it's very important to take out some of this human middleware, get it to a high level of confidence, for example, in terms of testing, a high level of fidelity in terms of discovery, so you're not making a claim about an asset that doesn't actually belong to that subsidiary and was part of a cloud instance that was created and then taken down and belongs to somebody else now. It has to go down to that level of depth. Otherwise, as a process, it breaks down. In fact, actually, that was one of the big realizations for us in our second and third year was we have to do a lot to work with other groups and encourage the security teams as part of the onboarding experience to pick and choose some of the subsidiaries that we find have the most significant risk and build the people and process parts to collaborate with them early on. Because if the security team doesn't know to do that and they're busy and the CISO understands the risk and they make the investment, then things fall apart at that level. And so thinking about it in terms of the people and process piece up front and building out the customer success DNA, I guess, or the professional services DNA, is important, whether you do it directly or through a partner. Without that, it tends to collapse. But this is what leads to limiting, constraining the visibility at that somewhere in that 10, 50, 60% range. This is what leads to the MTTR being too long or to too much inefficiency, making the process itself too costly. It can be automated, and that is now, as I said, there's even more of an opportunity to not just automate all of this, but to improve the quality of it with AI in certain areas, especially discovery, attribution, even prioritization, remediation. A little bit less so in risk detection, but I know people will dispute that with me, so I'll save that for a dinner discussion. But a lot of it is conducive to extensive improvements here, and that's really what will help us find all of those paths of low resistance and eliminate them before the attacker finds that one that they need to exploit. So this is sort of where we want to get to, and a lot of opportunity here for improving things. There's a life cycle behind this. I won't spend too much time on it, but it's useful to know how Gartner thinks of it, because this is what they're putting out there as how organizations should think of exposure management. It's a framework called Continuous Threat Exposure Management, and it has a few different stages. I'll just touch on them very quickly. It's different from what you would expect. Some of you may have seen it. But in each of these stages, I just want to touch on what are the opportunities for innovation and disruption. So exposure management is sort of the market, and CTEM is the framework. And this is what Gartner is talking a lot to organizations about. We're seeing RFIs left and right driven by this. So the first part is simply a recommendation to think about the problem statement from the standpoint, from the perspective of a scope, and that scope should be things like pick a subset of your organization, because otherwise the problem is too much to take on, and get to real results with it, such as the web apps that are revenue generating. Or it could be a different scope. But something like that to narrow the problem down. A lot of tools weren't focused on this, and we're trying to solve the problem too broadly. And this has been Gartner's recommendation, which is creating an opportunity for change in the way the workflow of products happens. Again, an opportunity for disruption. And then there's discovery, which for whatever reason, Gartner's view of it spans uncovering what an organization looks like, as well as the testing for risk. But this is about those vulnerabilities, whether they're classic CVEs or misconfigs or weak creds or whatever else. And then there's the prioritization piece where, as I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity to really uncover a lot more about web apps and other products, being able to classify them into environments and platforms, because all of those things really help with the business prioritization of risk, along with external threat intelligence. Now, another area that's emerging that we hear organizations wanting to factor into exposure management is a brand risk. So understanding whether there's stolen credentials and where do they apply, even testing them, that form of intelligence is entering the prioritization phase as a requirement. And then figuring out truly which ones are at risk through validation. What is actually easily exploitable? What is the wider network access opportunity? That's actually led to another interesting trend, which is that organizations want all the findings from the discovery phase mapped to the kill chain stages of MITRE attacks framework. We do some of that, but we do it from the front end, so it would be mostly mapped to the early stages like recon. But I think if organizations that look at it from the internal perspective can combine, then you can really draw out the full kill chains that could emerge. And then mobilization, which is where I think there's a lot of need for better integrations in security. I worked with a few firms in different places to help build out these security integrations, because a lot of the iPaaS platforms focus on generic IT integrations and not security-centric integrations. They aren't optimized for the SOC, but that is changing, and this is another area where there's opportunity. So I'm going to skip past this in the interest of time, some of the details here, but I think I talked through most of them with scoping. There's a lot of opportunity to do more in discovery, and AI can do a lot here. With discovery, it really is about improving the quality of our testing, the coverage of testing, the fidelity of that testing. And it's particularly pronounced, I think, for there's an opportunity now to move around budgets tied to web apps and pen testing budgets. And and prioritization is there's a lot of opportunity to start leveraging threat intelligence in new and interesting ways, again, where AI has a lot of opportunity to leverage. So those are the main areas, and mobilization is the one part where there's a lot of people and process element involved, and I think that'll always be the case. But we can help with things like remediation or enablement. Still a lot of gaps between the security team and what the ops team have to do that can be nicely documented, extracted, and delivered by AI capabilities. So my time is up, and I wanted to close with one slide, so I'll skip past the impact, because I think we've talked about it enough, and just close with what I think are some of the key takeaways here. It's a big trend. It's a trend for a good reason. The problem statement is significant, and the opportunity to fix it is there. There's some progress that's been made, but for those of you who are on the founding side, if you're looking for a problem that's proximate and that's significant in the minds of the buyer, then certainly exposure management over the last year and the next couple of years fits that mold. I'm not sure why it won't proceed, but since it won't, I think it's because of the time. I will say there's one other thing that's very useful from pitching to security teams when it comes to exposure management. The external side can predominantly be done in a black box, seedless manner. So think about pitching to a CISO. Many of you have great ideas. I've spoken to some of you. And now just think about going to that CISO and saying, hey, here's a significant problem. I can solve it in this unique way. And the CISO says, that sounds great. OK, so what do you need? And you have to queue up behind 6 other projects because it's going to take resources and time to do it. You really can get to 80, 90% of the value of what I showed you here in a black box manner without asking the CISO for any information, because you're looking at it from the attacker's perspective. You're finding the information out there. You need their consent to scan. But other than that, you could do this in a black box, zero deployment manner. That's a huge benefit. And I know that we talked about their need to focus, but I would say there is a cross-region, cross-vertical demand from small to large organizations, and a lot of innovation potential across all these stages. And then lastly, just to bring it home, it seems like, from what I saw, a lot of growing founding, venture, buyer readiness in the local market here. So hope to see more innovation in some of these areas, and thank you for your time.